This is fantastic. So my name is Bobby, and I am the director for the Osher Institute at MSU. And I'll be here throughout the presentation, so afterwards if you have questions, feel free. You can ask me. I did bring some flyers. If you aren't familiar with our programs, there's a list here, and they're all listed on our website. And we focus on lifelong learning and adult education programs for those who are generally 50 and better. Notice I didn't use over 50 and better, and getting better. So anyway, we have a big line of programs this semester, and we're celebrating 20 years as a lifelong learning organization. First as Wanderlust, and then we've transitioned to the Osher Institute in the last 2 years. So welcome this evening. We're thrilled to be able to partner with the Celebrate Library on these programs. It's always fun to see what the Celebrate Library staff come up with, what Liz came up with this semester for our speakers. And we are diving in a couple months to planning for fall speakers. So if you have ideas, always feel free to run them by Liz or myself, and we'll go with that. But I have, I just want to tell you, Osher, there are 125 Osher Institutes across the nation, if you're not familiar with that. We're all affiliated with Institutes of Higher Education. We're all independent of one another. We all share the same benefactor, the Bernard Osher Foundation. And where was I going with this? I'm telling you this for a purpose. See, it's not just when you're, I am 50 over, so maybe that's my hold on, I have an idea of why I was telling you this. Oh, I know I was telling you. Okay, so every other year, there's a survey that takes place with Osher Institutes across the nation to get sort of a cross-section temperature on interest and membership and everything else. And when I pulled into this parking lot this evening, I thought, there we go. This survey every other year, the first thing that not all, but that comes up to the top, the first topic of interest for Osher Institute across the nation is history. So in my mind, I was thinking, oh, I wonder what our dress going to be this evening. And I pulled in, and I could see more cars in the sidewalk, on the street, and people pulling out so they couldn't find space. And I thought, why am I surprised that this is such a great turnout? So thanks for joining us. Thanks for coming out this evening. And I'm going to turn it over to Liz.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this evening's Ollie and One Book Upgrade presentation, History and Chronicles of the Bozeman Trail. Our sponsor for the Ollie event this semester is First Interstate Bank. And Kenny Noble, Stockton Bank, and Humanities Montana have graciously supported our One Book community read. This year is based around Michael Punk's Ridgeline. He was the author of The Revenant. And that's our next Ollie collaboration presentation. The author will be visiting in February, if anybody is interested. We do have these for checkout downstairs, so if you have a library card anywhere in the county, including Bozeman, you can check one of these out and give it a read. Oh, my name is Liz, by the way. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the Belgrade Library. Before I introduce our presenter, I just wanted to give a few announcements. First, our bathrooms and emergency exit is in our back. Please remember to silence your cell phone. And then finally, if you're participating in our winter reading program, which goes through the end of February, you can be sure to sign your name on our participation sheet. You get an extra entry for attending a live event. You also get an entry if you read our book. And we'll draw for that at the end of February. We have a lot of great prizes for it. Gift cards to local restaurants and organizations. My big prize is a trail ride for 2 with 320 guest ranch. If you really want to experience, a little bit more of the Bozeman Trail, get on a horse. And then our future One Book presentations coming up next week, Thursday night, same place, same time. We're going to have a lecture on the Appaloosa or Crow Nation history. The week after that, we'll have one on weapons of the Gold Rush era with the Museum of the Rockies curator, bring some of the collections to see too. And then the week after that, February 10th, is our author event for our series. So I hope you can attend one of those as well if you're interested. All right, so tonight's presenter is the research coordinator at the Gallatin History Museum, and she's the author of the book Legendary Locals of Bozeman, which I love reading. She helps manage the museum's research library and helps assemble the Gallatin History Quarterly. So if you could please help me welcome Rachel Phillips.
Well, thank you so much, Liz and Bobby and Liz for inviting me to talk to you today, and for all of you coming out tonight. It's not too bad to go back traveling, but can everyone in the back hear me okay? I'll try and speak up as loud as I can. I am not a Bozeman Trail expert, so I am guessing that a lot of people in the audience here tonight know a lot more about it than I do. I do like stories, and in my job at the Gallatin History Museum, I come across a lot of stories, and so a big part of the presentation tonight will be sharing some people's stories about their journeys on the Bozeman Trail or their connections with the Bozeman Trail. So I'll be reading some of those to you. The picture, if you're curious about that you see here, that's actually Bozeman from the early 1870s. I couldn't find, there's not a lot of photographs, at least in our collection at the museum, of the Bozeman Trail itself. There's one that I'll have a little bit later on, but gives you an idea of what the vehicles were like that people traveled on when they came up the Bozeman Trail. I'm going to talk a little bit first about some brief history of the trail and some of the major players. A little bit about the route, people like Jim Bridger, who was not necessarily associated with the Bozeman Trail, but important to talk about in connection with the Bozeman Trail. And then I'll go on to share some of the stories, like I mentioned before, of some of the travelers on the trail. Two of them, in particular, settled here in Gallatin County, so I'll note that. And I also wanted to relate that I am not a Native person, and I think that Native people are better able to share their views and thoughts on the Bozeman Trail. I'll share a little bit, most notably of Black Elk at the very end here. But the Bozeman Trail history, I think, means a lot of different things to different people. So for white settlers, the Bozeman Trail was a route that brought them up to southwest Montana, and opportunities to get wealthy, escape the Civil War, start a new life. Whereas for Native people, it represented an invasion of their traditional hunting grounds and areas that they had lived in for centuries. So there's a lot of different viewpoints on the Bozeman Trail, and I like to leave the other viewpoints up to the people who are members of that group. So I highly recommend attending, I think it's the presentation next week, Dr. Shane Doyle talking about the Crow and the Bozeman Trail. He's a great presenter, so I highly recommend coming to that one. So first of all, a little bit about the route. Hopefully most of you can see this a little bit. The red dotted line is the route of the Bozeman Trail in general. I think the route varied a little bit depending on the year and the wagon train that was traveling over it. The gold rush in Montana started in the 1862 and 1863. We had gold discovered in Alder Gulch and Bannock and Virginia City were early mining communities that sprang up. And a lot of miners back then jumped from one gold strike to another. So you had people coming up all of a sudden to southwest Montana from Colorado, and they traveled throughout the west following gold rushes. So you had all of a sudden a lot of people that wanted to come up to this area. And a few people in the area that decided to capitalize on that and lead or guide people up to southwest Montana. One of them, I should note also that the general route of the Bozeman Trail, that wasn't invented by John Bozeman or any one person, I would probably say. I think Native people traveled through that area for centuries, so there were parts of that whole route that had been there for a very long time. So you had people like John Bozeman that I'll talk about that developed the route a little bit more and promoted it, but the general pathway had been there for quite some time.
Where did it start in the 37?
Oh, yes. So it started in various places depending on each individual wagon train. Generally, it branched off of, I should have pointed this out earlier, the Oregon Trail is kind of running down through this lower part. It branched off of the Oregon Trail in southeastern Wyoming. And people did travel to southwest Montana prior to some of these more major routes coming through. They would often either go up the Missouri River, which is off the map, and then travel overland down into southwest Montana, or they would take the Oregon Trail a little bit further west and then go straight up through what's now northern Utah and through Idaho. But generally, yeah, Wyoming is the square here. So southwest Montana, or southeast Wyoming up past the Bighorn Mountains, traveling on the east side of the Bighorn Mountains, and then up following the Yellowstone west, down through Bozeman and the Gallatin Valley, and generally ending in Virginia City, but different people ended in different places, I guess. So I'll talk a little bit about Jim Bridger just briefly. He was a mountain man, well-known mountain man in the West. Was born in the 1840s in Virginia, 1804, and moved with his family to Missouri when he was a young teenager, and then was orphaned shortly thereafter, so he had to fend for himself quite soon, and that's when he started fur trapping. I think when he was about 17, he joined an expedition that traveled up to explore the upper Missouri, so that's how he ended up in the Northwest, and spent the next several decades traveling around the Northwest and exploring and trapping and getting involved in trail development, as it seems. Jim Bridger's, and I'll show another map here later on, but he developed, when the gold rush started in the early 1860s, he developed an alternate route to the Bozeman Trail, which passed, its major difference from the Bozeman Trail was that it passed west of the Bighorn Mountains, which was a slightly longer route, but a little less dangerous. It didn't go through Sioux and Cheyenne territory, and one drawback to it was that there was, from accounts I've read, less water and feed for animals, so it got a little bit long and hard to get through at times. But the Bridger Trail was one of the other major alternatives to the Bozeman Trail. And of course, most people probably know who that is. That's John Bozeman. I wish I had a photograph of John Jacobs to show you, but there doesn't seem to be one, or if there is, it's very hard to find. But John Jacobs I'll say a little bit about him first, but he was also another well-known mountain man and fur trader. He probably came here, spent time in the Northwest a little bit, about 20 years before John Bozeman, so maybe the 1840s he ended up here. Not a lot is known about John Jacobs. He apparently was a little bit hard to get along with and had a bit of a temper, according to some accounts, so he didn't always get along very well with some of the people on the immigrant trains that came through. Jacobs, interestingly, probably was probably the first one to really more formalize the Bozeman Trail route, or what would become the Bozeman Trail route. Jacobs had passed that way before and sort of knew the area quite a bit. And it was John Bozeman who was the big promoter and leader that kind of got the trail really going. So John Bozeman himself, most of you probably know a little bit about him, but he was born in Georgia in about 1835, we think. And his father, when he was young, left the family and traveled to California for the gold rush there in the late 1840s. Never made it to California, died on the way, so they never saw him again. John Bozeman ended up doing the very same thing. He got married and had 3 daughters, and the gold rush hit Colorado, and late 1850s, early 1860s, and he left his family and went to Colorado to try his hand at gold mining. And most of you probably know the rest of the story with John Bozeman, but he never made it back either. He was killed in 1867, so kind of a similar thing. But John Bozeman spent some time in Colorado and then came up to southwest Montana during the gold rush and spent a little bit of time in Deer Lodge and the Gallatin Valley, where he teamed up with a couple of other well-known people around here, Daniel Rouse and William Beal, or Bell. And those two, Rouse and Beal, stayed behind in the Gallatin Valley in 1864, 3 and 4, and started building the first buildings in what would become the town of Bozeman. While John Bozeman went to lead the first successful wagon train to the valley that year. So Bozeman teamed up with Jacobs in 1862, 1863. Their idea was to develop a route and guide people up to the gold mines in southwest Montana. And Bozeman also had this plan of creating a agricultural community or a supply town in the Gallatin Valley, which eventually becomes Bozeman. Here's another map. This one shows the Bozeman and Bridger trails, and you can see the major difference. Jim Bridger's trail is the red, John Bozeman's is the black dotted line. So the big difference there is one went west of the Bighorn Mountains and one went east. They both ended up near the Clark's Fork of the Yellowstone and then followed the Yellowstone up over Bozeman Pass and down into the Gallatin Valley. The Bozeman Trail, for being such a well-known route, it kind of overshadows the Bridger Trail. Most people have heard of the Bozeman Trail more. Was not very long-lasting. It only was really active for 5 years or so. There were a lot of problems with that route. Of course, as I said before, it passed through this area, which was traditional hunting areas for Sioux and Cheyenne and Arapaho and lots of others. It kind of trespassed on their homelands, and there were some violations of the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1851. So there was some issues even going through that way in the first place. Should never have gone that way, and as it became more traveled, more and more people traveled it, and there were more and more problems along the Bozeman Trail with Native people. So one nickname that came to be was the Bloody Bozeman. It was a dangerous route to go. So I'll have one more background slide here. This is just a short timeline. Bozeman Trail history there's a lot of it, and I can not talk about everything here tonight, but there's just some of the major events that occurred along the Bozeman Trail. So as I said before, Jacobs and Bozeman started trying to develop a more formal route starting in 1862. In 1863, John Bozeman and a small group of, I think it was probably about 46 wagons, started out in the first attempt to travel the Bozeman Trail from Fort Laramie, or along the North Platte River, kind of near present-day Casper, Wyoming, is about where they started. They got as far as the South Fork of the Powder River and met a group of Sioux and Cheyenne who told them, you can't go any farther, you got to turn around. So most of the wagon train turned back around. They attempted to get help from the U.S. Army, and the military said, no, we're not supposed to get involved with that. It's violating the treaty. This is their homeland at that time. And most of the group disbanded, and John Bozeman and 9 other men decided they would continue on to southwest Montana. It's a little bit unclear to me exactly their exact route at that time. They did eventually, those 10 people, make it to Alder Gulch. It appears to me different accounts seem to be a little confusing about that, but it looks to me like they actually went more closely to what Bridger's route was. They went up the west side of the Bighorn Mountains instead of what would be later called the Bozeman Trail. But John Bozeman went with them, and they had a number of incidents on that trip. They were trying to travel really light and fast, and they lost their one pack horse. The horse fell over the side of the precipice, and they ended up having to try and hunt whatever they could eat, going for days without food and water, and barely made it to the Yellowstone. And they did eventually make it to Alder Gulch, but I call that one an unsuccessful attempt. I think their route to me looks like it wasn't the traditional Bozeman Trail route. So the first successful trip down the Bozeman Trail was the next year in 1864, and John Bozeman was involved in that again. He picked up a party of settlers in southeastern Wyoming, and they made it up to southwest Montana. That same summer, Jim Bridger also was testing his Bridger Trail route on the west side of the Bighorn, so the two parties were sort of moving at the same time. They both ended up in southwest Montana approximately the same time. Bozeman Trail ended up becoming the much better, much more well-known route. Jim Bridger's trail was used quite a bit, but the Bozeman Trail got all the attention probably because of John Bozeman and his personality and the leader that he was and the promoter that he was. So as more and more people came up the trail, we had more and more conflicts with indigenous people. And so by 1866, the military established 3 forts, Reno, Phil Kearny, and C.F. Smith along the route of the Bozeman Trail to protect settlers traveling. And also that same year, you had one of the major conflicts involving the Army on the Bozeman Trail. There were others, but this was one of the big ones, the Fetterman fight, which involved a group of soldiers at Fort Phil Kearny who had gone out to do some wood cutting. There's not a lot of lumber in that area, and So they probably had to travel a little ways, but they were attacked by a group of Sioux and Cheyenne, and a party was dispatched from the fort. Their orders were to protect the woodcutters, bring them back to the fort, and not pursue the attacking force. The Captain Fetterman, that was in charge of this smaller group of about 80 men, was disobeyed orders and thought, well, I'm going to track down. He was pretty boastful about being able to defeat thousands of big party of Sioux warriors, and so he took his 80 men and was lured further away from the fort, and that was their end. They were killed. All of that whole group was killed, and that was one of the major conflicts on the Bozeman Trail. Or others.
Our One Book Belgrade Ridgeline book is based around the Fetterman fight. If you wanted to read more about it, just wanted to say that.
Great. Yeah, that's one of the bigger ones. Eventually, the U.S. military couldn't keep the Bozeman Trail open. Too many settlers, more and more conflict, and they abandoned the forts. At that time, at least Fort Reno and Phil Kearny were burned. Maybe all of them were burned by Native people, and the Bozeman Trail pretty much ceased in 1868. I mean, there were still people traveled it for long after that, but the big height of the travel on the Bozeman Trail was about 5 years, from the early 1860s to the late 1860s. So that's a little background. There's a lot more that I'm sure many people in this room know. At this point, are there any questions or comments? Yeah.
Fort Phil Kearny is worth going down to look at. They're rebuilding it, setting it up. Has a nice museum, so it's really worth going down to see.
Definitely.
So when you say that 5-year window was for the most travel, what volume of travelers was on that trail?
That's a good question. I read that several times. I'm trying to remember. Like I said, I'm not an expert. It was several thousand at least.
I think in 1866 there were over 2,000.
Yeah, that was
Got
kind of,
1 year along.
yeah.
Got one summer.
Mm-hmm.
People or wagons?
I believe people. The wagons, those trains seem to vary a little bit. I mean, I found references to, around 50, but there were more or less. But there were oftentimes, I think, several groups in different stages of travel along that. I mean, it took several months. Most people started in, I think, April and ended up a lot of times in July or August in southwest Montana, so it was a long trip.
When they stopped using the Bozeman Trail, where did they go? What route did they use after that?
That's a good question. I think one of the reasons the Bozeman Trail, besides the major conflicts on it with Native people, was that they had finally gotten the Union Pacific Railroad finished enough at that time, and that was a little bit further south, so people could take the railroad to Utah, for example, and then come up from there, and that was a little bit faster. So I think that was a big reason. A lot of people still took steamboats up the Missouri River, but I think the railroad was probably a big part of it. Someone else might know more about that thing. Anyone else? Okay, well, I'll start by sharing some stories now, and I'm going to read some of these. Most of these come from a great book. It's actually a 2-volume set, but there's a shorter version out there by Susan Badger Doyle called Journeys to the Land of Gold. Diaries a collection of diaries and reminiscences of people that traveled the Bozeman Trail. This first one is not from that. This one we found fairly recently in the local newspaper, and I thought it was interesting, so I was going to include it. George Irvin here, he was one of the 9 men, I guess, that accompanied John Bozeman on that first sort of unsuccessful trip on the Bozeman Trail, or the Bridger Trail, in 1863. So I thought I'd read a little bit of his. He talks about their initial attempt to go up the Bozeman Trail and how they turned back. And then he gives a little character sketch of John Bozeman, which I thought was kind of interesting, so people can get an idea what he was like. But George Irvin here, maybe I'll talk a little bit about the rest of his life at the end. But he did start in 1863 with John Bozeman and the party of about 50 wagons out of southeast Wyoming and Fort Laramie area, and they ended up near the Powder River, South Fork of the Powder River, I believe, and were turned back. So he was part of that group I mentioned earlier. And they wanted the military to get involved, and the military wouldn't at that point. So Irvin, along with this small group of men, they were the ones that decided to continue on to Alder Gulch. So this is, I'll leave that up there for a while. This is a excerpt that was written by Irvin, or else reported to someone else who wrote it. It appeared in the Avant Courier newspaper in Bozeman on January 12, 1888. So a couple decades after he traveled the trail. But he remarked in the article, 24 years ago, I thought I liked adventure. Now I am in love with civilization. As a means of locomotion, a Pullman car beats a prairie schooner or a cayuse, and I speak from absolute knowledge. The newspaper asked me to tell something of the trip into Montana, which I made in the company with John Bozeman. Some of the memories are not pleasant, yet I cannot refrain from complying with the request. In the year 1862, John Bozeman, whose adventurous spirit had led him to traverse all the wilds of the West, made his way back to Fort Laramie for the purpose of organizing a band to settle in northern Idaho. His proposition was to avoid the old circuitous route, which necessitated a trip through Colorado, Utah, and the southern portion of the then vast territory, and find a route that would annihilate space. After a short stay at the fort, he was successful in finding a band of immigrants, and in the spring of 1863, started with a party that consisted of about 100 men, 10 women, 80 wagons. The number of wagons differs a little bit in each outfit, and the necessary horses and outfit. Among the male portion of the caravan were Honorable Sam Word and myself. The start was made in high glee, and all went well until we reached a point about 80 miles north of the Platte River, when we were confronted by a band of Indians, and our further progress resisted. A member of the party and myself were at once sent back to secure aid. We rode as fast as possible to Deer Creek Station on the Platte, which was then the outpost of the Western Union Telegraph Company, and sent a dispatch to Fort Laramie announcing the condition of affairs. In accordance with regulations, it was referred to Brigadier General Keene, then commanding the department, with headquarters at Omaha, and by him referred to the War Department for instructions, and the answer soon came that no aid could be rendered the party by the military. The reason assigned was that all the country north of the Yellowstone and above that of the Missouri River was Indian country upon which immigrants had no right to enter. We returned at once and imparted the information to the party, and the result was a decision on the part of the majority to abandon the expedition, which was done, and the caravan returned to the fort. There were, however, 10 of the party who, headed by Bozeman, concluded to carry out their original intention and make the journey. Having come to this conclusion, we decided to start at once. At midnight, we left the camp, the whole party turning out to bid us goodbye and wish us Godspeed. Our route was the crossing from the headwaters of the Powder River between the Bighorn and Wind Rivers, the latter being a portion of the main chain of the Rockies. Distance to be traveled was supposed to be between 600 and 700 miles through an Indian country. The party were all mounted, but traveling light, there being only one pack horse for the 10 of us. The provisions consisted of 50 pounds of baked bread and crackers, about the same amount of dried buffalo meat, and a full supply of salt, the party depending upon the country and their rifles for game. And as I mentioned earlier, that poor horse fell over the precipice and they lost a lot of their food. And Irvin mentions again that missed the salt quite a bit after that point. Apparently when they were getting close to the Yellowstone River and very low on spirits, they thought they were gonna not make it, and John Bozeman finally located, according to Irvin, water, and then was able to kill a bald eagle, which was the first food they've had in quite a while. So according to him, that's what happened towards the end of their journey. I was also going to read a little bit about his description of John Bozeman, because I thought that was interesting, and most people are familiar with John Bozeman, and it gives a good example of how people at that time really idealized John Bozeman and were quite grateful to him for leading them up here. Of course, not everyone liked him, judging by his death, but he was a very, I guess, charismatic person at the time. So Irvin says this about Bozeman. In the year 1864, Mr. Bozeman went by way of the Salt Lake to Fort Laramie and piloted the immigration to Alder Gulch by the Bozeman route through Bozeman Pass, within sight of the present town of Bozeman. John Bozeman was born in the state of Georgia and was evidently but little education, emigrated in his youth with what was known as the Green Russell crowd to Georgia Gulch, Colorado in 1858, remaining there for a year. Colorado became too civilized for his adventurous spirit, and camping on the different trails of Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, and Idaho in 1862, he arrived on Grasshopper Creek in the then county of Missoula, territory of Idaho, now Bannock City, county of Beaverhead, territory of Montana, from where the adventures that I have above narrated commenced. Mr. Bozeman's restless activity and love of adventure prevented his possible contentment in any mining camp, and led to his death on the Yellowstone River 4 years later at the hands of his enemies. At his death, he was probably 33 years of age, 6 feet 2 inches high, weighing 200 pounds, supple, active, tireless, and of handsome, stalwart presence. He was genial, kindly, and as innocent as a child in the ways of the world. He had no conception of fear, and no matter how sudden a call was made on him, day or night, he would come up with his rifle in hand. He never knew what fatigue was, and was a good judge of all distances that should be traveled by man or horse. He was an unerring shot, and when you saw his rifle leveled, you knew that you were not to go supperless to bed. In all the legends and traditions of Mr. Bozeman, I have never heard him charged with a dishonorable act. He is one of the historic characters of Montana, and although his companion for months in what he considered extreme peril and sharing his blankets night after night, I feel that no words of mine can do justice to the unpretentious hero. So he was a reflection of what a lot of people thought about John Bozeman at that time. George Irvin himself was born in Chicago in the 1840s and lived in Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Iowa. After his experience traveling up to Montana, he did do a little bit of mining in Alder Gulch for a couple of years, but went on to spend most of his career in public service. He served as a tax assessor, a postmaster, U.S. Marshal, even was sheriff of Butte for a while. He lived most of his life in Montana in Butte. So with that, we'll move on to the next story. This is a Gallatin Valley early resident, Davis Wilson, who was also born in the 1840s in Canton, New York. Before heading west, he attended St. Lawrence University in New York and Oberlin College in Ohio. Had some experience working in dry goods stores and served in the Union Army, spent some time in California, worked for a newspaper, did a variety of things, and then joined his cousin, Charles Rich, the trip up to Southwest Montana. Their plan was to start a general store, a dry goods store to cater to the miners in Southwest Montana. And so this first selection I'll read from Davis's diary talks a little bit about what it was like to leave home and family back east to travel on such a long journey on the Bozeman Trail. And this selection is from Susan Badger Doyle's book, Journeys to the Land of Gold. But Davis Wilson wrote this May 7th, 1866. The morning found me up at an early hour, the household all astir with preparations for my leaving home. I was to start for the new territory of Montana. A company had been formed, and we were to leave our little village of Canton at 4 o'clock on the afternoon train. My dear sisters and younger brother were flying from room to room, performing little acts of kindness, which were to be the last tender services for years. We knew not how many. But as quite everything had been done for me that could be, a little dark-haired sister, begging with her large blue eyes that all the rest had done something for me but she, having finished the sewing of a button on my shirt, this busy searching about for more to do and wandering from room to room was more for the purpose of keeping back the tears and making my departure as cheerful as they might. At last the carriage drove up, which my father was to drive himself and my mother, to detain the party as long as she could, was to go with us to the village. Then came goodbye to sisters, the last kiss and kindly spoken word, but the tears would come, and as we drove rapidly away, the choking in my throat was all that I could hear. Arrived at the village, in the whirl and confusion of scraping together the company's baggage, the meeting and God bless yous of friends, old friends, dear friends, and careless friends, made the parting with my father and mother comparatively easy, and the unhappy couple drove away in sad silence. May the scenes of that eventful morning be fresh in memory as long as breath supplies this body. By noon, everything was ready, and as I took my last meal in Canton, I said goodbye to my sister and the others. Charlie Caldwell and myself spent the remainder of the afternoon in making short calls. At the station, we found our friends waiting to say farewell and kissing all the ladies and shaking hands with all the gentlemen. We were aboard the cars and off. So Wilson, a lot of folks that were going to travel the Bozeman Trail took a train from their homes in the east to points further west, and from there jumped off on wagon trains. And next I'll read a little bit that he wrote about the dangers traveling on the Bozeman Trail. Besides attacks from native people angry that settlers were passing through, you also had groups like this that were traveling with a bunch of livestock, and that also led to stealing attempts. So they were always on constant watch to guard the livestock and cattle with them. So this selection is from a couple month or so later, Tuesday, July 24th, he writes, Charlie Rick discovered an ambush this morning with about a half dozen Indians who were undoubtedly lying in wait for our stop when we took them to water. A few shots, however, frightened them away. Broke camp between 7 and 8 o'clock. Scouts were sent on all sides to give the alarm in case the Indians made their appearance. Saw and noticed where a train ahead of us had lost 2 men. One of our scouts killed 2 antelope. A spur of the Rocky Mountains, this would be the Bighorn Mountains he's referring to, was seen in advance, covered with snow. The whole country wore a sublime aspect. No halt was made, but drove till dark and camped on the dry fork of the Powder River. Feed and water scarce. Thursday, July 26th. Had to dig for water, found enough to water all the mules. Phillips lost one of his mules this morning, died from lung fever, got underway about 11 o'clock, came out upon the open country and made Fort Reno about 5 o'clock, camped near the fort, hear awful stories about the Indians who have been murdering and plundering trains in good earnest. They are on the warpath and are determined to keep the whites from the upper country. The greatest portion of the force, soldiers, he's referring to, have gone up about 55 miles from here where they intend to move this post. And 2 days later, on July 28th, the Indians came down hard upon our herd in forenoon, but the herders managed to drive them down by the river and save them while we with our guns ran to support them. And they fled, but drove off 9 yoke of cattle. A party of soldiers and our boys mounted mules and horses and went after them. They regained the stock. They had shot arrows in nearly all of the cattle, but none were very seriously injured. Charlie Rich and I went out with our guns to scout. Sunday, July 29th, was over at the captain's office writing letters. While there, a government mule train came in with over 50 wagons. Several trains behind, they kept coming in from day to day. The train in which our friends Barton and Dearborn were in came up. Barton and Dearborn's brother were killed in a fight with the Indians, with 6 others of their party. They were a sad-looking set. 8 were killed and 2 wounded out of their whole party. Charlie Rich and I were down near the river as C.L. Dearborn and Charlie Caldwell came up. At sight of us, he burst into tears. He shook our hands warmly but could not speak. He came to our tent with us, and as we got him a lunch, he told us their story. It was truly affecting and a sad one indeed. Charles Barton was most barbarously murdered. He was found with 20 arrows piercing his breast and was cut open with the knife left sticking in his side. His whiskers were scalped from his chin, and scalps were taken from the top of his head and from behind each ear. Was stabbed with a knife in several places around the eyes and otherwise horribly mutilated. He leaves a wife and 3 children. His body and that of young Husted, who was from another train, were in such condition when found that they buried them where they fell, between Brown Spring and Dry Fork of Cheyenne to the right of the road upon some bluffs across the creek. The others were taken to the road and buried. In all the trains that have come up to the present time, there have been 10 killed and 5 wounded. Nathan Floyd had his head cut off. How many have been killed who were in advance of us, we do not know. The captain of the post has had 33 killed reported to him. The mules got frightened and broke out of the corral last night about 1 o'clock, and we chased them for an hour before we got them in again. They broke 2 wagons. So it's an interesting mixture of danger and everyday life on the trail, stock running off. So Davis Wilson settled in Bozeman and worked as a school teacher, was a clerk in the Wilson and Rich general store early on. He's perhaps a little bit overshadowed by his more well-known relatives in the area, Lester Wilson, his brother, who operated the Wilson Company department store in Bozeman for quite a few decades, and then his nephew, Fred Wilson, Lester Wilson's son, who was quite a prominent architect in southwest Montana. So Davis spent the rest of his life in the Gallatin Valley and ended up becoming a ordained minister, was really involved with the Presbyterian Church establishment in Bozeman. And next group is the other Gallatin Valley settlers, John Jay and Margaret Tomlinson. And this is an image from the Montana history book published in 1885 that shows a artist's rendering of what their little farm looked like near Salesville, which is today called Gallatin Gateway. The Tomlinsons traveled the Bozeman Trail in 1864. They branched off of the Oregon Trail with a group called the Coffinbury Train. near what is today Casper, Wyoming, and traveled with about 68 wagons, 173 men, and probably several hundred more women and children. John Tomlinson was 52 when he traveled the Bozeman Trail, and his wife Margaret was 29. John was born in 1812 in Maryland and studied engineering at a trade school and eventually went to operate several flour, lumber, and woolen mills in the Midwest. Margaret was born in 1834 in New York and was also well educated, and she had studied dressmaking and tailoring before moving to Iowa, which is where she met and married John. There are a couple interesting points of the Tomlinson diary, and their diary and Journeys to the Land of Gold has been combined. Apparently they each wrote a diary that both of these diaries were extremely similar to each other, so the author sort of combined them into one. There were a few differences, but most of what they had to say were pretty much identical to each other. The Tomlinsons carried sawmill equipment with them, so that was probably quite a chore to do. They also carried what they called a roadometer, which is basically just an odometer that they delighted in noting the mileage that they had gone in their diary. So there's a lot of mileage references. And their diary isn't quite as interesting and, I guess, adventurous as the other one, and I've added a few words here and there to make it more readable. But you'll see a lot of references to how far they've traveled. So they write, left Canton, Iowa for Idaho, which Montana used to be part of Idaho Territory, Sunday at 4 o'clock a.m., April 24th, 1864. Arrived at Des Moines City at 10 p.m. on Monday, May 9th. Commenced measuring with the roadometer, crossed the Missouri River Friday morning, May 20th, and left Omaha about May 21st. Arrived at the camp on the Platte River 4 miles above Fort Kearny, and this is actually Fort Kearny, Nebraska, not Wyoming, on June 1st. And here they noted that they were 200 miles from Omaha and 344 miles from Des Moines City, which is Des Moines, Iowa. And they noted there that they saw the first prairie dogs and first buffalo herds. Tuesday, June 14th. Roads muddy, angled across prairie to bluff, then again crossed to near the North Platte River, 8 miles to noon. Apparently, ledges of rock stick out of the bluffs in regular line of rows on the south side of the river, dotted over with little trees that looked like cedar. At noon it rained very hard. Made 14 miles and camped near the North Platte River. Mrs. Tomlinson is very sick. Dr. Hull sent her medicine, and Mrs. Mulcair cooked fish and potatoes for Mrs. Tomlinson. Saturday, July 2nd, 1864. Made 13 miles to noon. Went over one of the craggiest countries I ever saw. Soldiers passed our dining place. Made 5 miles this afternoon over sterile prairie. Mr. Boher shod right forefoot of the bay horse. Made about 10 miles in the morning through wide undulating prairie. We dined near a river where I found a pearl-handled knife. And I've seen references to a lot of items just left along the trail that people were constantly finding, and for many years after that as well. Saturday, July 16th. After laying over since Wednesday night for increased numbers, we left at 4:30 a.m. Made 2.5 miles through a sandy valley, 3 miles and good road to breakfast camp. The country is rolling, the road's hard. Saw snowy peaks in the distance. Those were probably the Bighorn Mountains. Tuesday, July 19th. Made 12 miles down a dry creek. Crossed 36 times. This is a winding creek. 8 miles to park where we broke the ox wagon. Stopped for repairs, rained 5 hours. Thursday, July 21st. 880 miles total. Water clear and good with both good wood and grass. A scalp was found. It had beautiful black hair. The blood wasn't dry yet. It was in the top of a cedar tree. Sunday, July 24th, Bighorn Mountains on the west, 13 miles for the day. These creeks are beautiful mountain streams with stony beds. Beautiful roads all day except deep pitches at crossing creeks. Tuesday, July 9th, uphilly ascent 3 miles to a summit, then 2.5 miles more to a valley. Northeast of the road, buffaloes were in the thousands. Scared by 4 Indians meeting the train, afterwards they were at camp. Made 12 miles today, good road. We camped 3/4 of a mile northeast of the road. Poor, filthy water, mired by beaver dams. Monday, August 15th. En ridge and descent to Yellowstone Valley. Extensive fair prairie and steep descent to camp. Made 13 miles today. Dog split in train. Perhaps some of our readers will not fully understand what is meant by the dog split. There were quite a number of people who were in favor of dogs, as there were quite a number of dogs. Those dogs got to fighting and caused a runaway, and nearly caused a fatal accident of 2 ladies. So the train was divided. Those having dogs went together, and those having none did the same. Afterward, it was called the dog train, which was conducted by Captain Fridley, and the other by Captain Coffinberry. However, it did not cause any serious hard feeling. Tuesday, August 16th, 1864. Near meeting of 2 branches of a river, and this would probably be the Yellowstone and the Clark's Fork River. Grand view from top of bluffs. Gentle decline to Clark's Fork River, across the river and up valley bearing northwest to the Yellowstone. The valley of this river is fine and wide. The uniform range of mountain bounding north of the valley is beautiful and dotted with pines. There is more than on other streams, 20.5 miles for the day. That was a better day. Wednesday, the 17th of August. 1 mile to road coming in on southwest side. This would probably be, he's referencing a road that it was probably the Bridger Trail coming in on their left. Up the valley of Dry Creek, or this would probably be Red Lodge Creek. Crossing several deep ravines, 6 miles to camp on the same creek. Mr. Shorthill was pretty frightened by a bear. The creek afforded good water, 2 inches deep and 6 foot wide. Sunday, August 21st. Our Templeton and I went to the creek, likely the Yellowstone River, for fish. I got 9. Wednesday, August 24th, 1864. Left the valley at Hot Springs. This was likely Hunter's Hot Springs, east of Livingston. And came to it again at the end of 6 miles. The latter is beautiful land. Afternoon, we went 1 mile up a high steep bluff. This is probably Sheep Mountain, east of Livingston. Then 5 miles more over broken hills to a creek running south into the Yellowstone, probably the Shields River. Made 15 miles today. Thursday, August 25th, 1864. Crossed the Shields River, past a spring where a part of Fridley's train were underway. Then over rolling country 4.5 miles to descent of a very steep high bluff to a valley of the Yellowstone. Camped at forks of Mining Road and road to Virginia City. And that's where I'll stop reading about the Tomlinsons. They noted that they had traveled 25 miles that last day to reach their destination, which was in the Great Gulch area south of Livingston. So they stopped a little bit short of where a lot of people kept going to Bozeman and Virginia City. But they noted that from Des Moines, at that point, they had come 1,272 miles. And from Omaha, 1,128. And from Richards Bridge in southeastern Wyoming, where they kind of left the main Oregon Trail, they'd gone 466 miles. So in 1865, after the Tomlinsons came to Montana, they established a sawmill between Immigrant Gulch and what is now Livingston on a creek that became known as Mill Creek. And they ended up supplying quite a bit of lumber to miners that were building boats to travel down the Yellowstone. So they stayed there for a couple of years before they moved to Bozeman and then moved on to Salesville, which is now Gallatin Gateway, where they operated a mill there for quite a few years. John died in 1888 and Margaret until 1917 when she passed. The next person, and this is unfortunately not a picture of Mary Foreman Kelly, because I didn't have one, but she has an interesting reminiscence that she wrote about traveling the Bozeman Trail in the 1920s, so actually many years after she did that. Mary Foreman was born in 1840 in Missouri and married Robert Kelly in about 1855. They lived in Kansas and Missouri. Robert was apparently a captain in the Confederate Army, but resigned his commission, traveled to Montana in 1863, after which he sent for his wife and their 2 daughters. At the time of their journey on the Bozeman Trail, Mary was 24, Kate, the older daughter, was 7, and Nanny was about 3. So she's writing this many years later, but she's reminiscing what it was like to travel up the Bozeman Trail in 1863. I received a letter from my husband, R.S. Kelly, who was then living in East Bannock, Montana, to make all preparations necessary to join him there, to buy a team, all provisions, essential for a journey that would take at least 6 months to make. To have my brother James Foreman purchase a light outfit and accompany me. My brother and myself were at this time living in Doniphan, Kansas. The general understanding was we were to meet the exodus of wagons to make this trek at Atchison, some 7 miles south of Doniphan. On the 28th day of May, 1864, everything being in readiness, we set out in our wagons for Atchison, Kansas. My wagon drawn by a span of well-broken mules, wagon bows, over which a heavy canvas covered, a spring seat. Inside of the wagon bed all my household effects I could conveniently pack, besides my 2 young children, Kate and Nanny. My brother James, with a well-equipped outfit, trailed my wagon. We bid our neighbors and friends a tearful farewell, the morning of our departure from Doniphan, making an early start and arriving at Atchison that same day. Here we found an assemblage of at least 80 wagons, men, women, and children. Among the men and women who were to make the trip, I recall Major Bowler, his wife and his children, late of Kansas City, Missouri, and a number of other friends. The greater number of the teams were oxen, some few horse teams and loose horses for riding purposes, a number of milk cows. All of the men were well armed with revolvers, rifles in the front seats of the wagons, easily got at in case of use. Plenty of provisions in each wagon, sufficient to last for 6 months. Water kegs and some extra jugs, some of which I was told contained snake bite medicine. I made no further inquiry or investigation. We camped on the outskirts of Atchison. When all in readiness, the manner of arrangements of the wagons in the procession, the proper method of packing our cooking utensils, and beds in the wagons to prevent confusion in their future use, how to cook out of doors using as little fuel as possible, and many other useful things we afterwards learned from experience. The order went forth to fall in line to keep some little distance from the wagon that preceded us. We strung out in the road to the west. My wagon and team was about the 20th in line, from the rear of the train, preceded by my brother James's team back of my wagon. It was so arranged that former acquaintances would be kept together in the early portion of the journey. Our direction for the first week out was south of west until we reached the old Oregon Trail, thence northwest until arrived at the Big Blue. I'm not positive what the Big Blue meant, maybe the flat. Here we halted for several days to give the women an opportunity to cook a supply of bread, wash clothes. Then the teams and wagons moved on towards the Platte River. The days were clear. The sun's rays became piercing towards the middle of the day, and the road filled with dust. The nearer we approached the Platte, the alkali more noticeable on the ground, and its effects began to tell on our faces. The water began to taste of alkali from the streams we crossed. We were therefore cautious in its use. Along our route here, about 75 miles before we reached the Platte River, I first saw the first prairie dog settlement. The sunflowers growing here and there along the road and antelope appeared in the distance in small herds. Occasionally, some of the hunters in the outfit would bring in the carcass of one, meat, but it required an ample supply to go around in our train to feed everyone. The antelope was difficult to approach near enough to shoot, so I was told by one of the hunters. Therefore, we had little fresh meat along this part of the journey. Major Bowler told me the buffalo had been driven back or out of this section, and we would see none until we traveled further up along the Platte River. Our travel along this part of the road, there was much daily sameness, changed in the afternoons, usually by torrents of rain and vivid electric displays. These storms, though, cooled the atmosphere and made traveling more pleasant. We reached the crossing of the Platte, this would be the South Platte River probably, about the latter part of July, to the best of my recollection, and found the river filled to overflow. It looked wider to me than the Missouri River at Atchison. Here we stopped to consider the best method to adopt to cross over this apparent sea of water with safety to all. The bed of the river appeared to me composed of sands almost on a level with the surrounding country. Its waters seemed to flow back and forth in sinuous and irregular course, changing its channel in every 24 hours. Its bed built up and then cut down, its sands filling up in one place, disappearing at others. As I have stated, it was apparently at its height when we got there, but by careful inspection, looking across it, one could plainly see here and there the tops of sandbars near its surface, showing it was not so deep as it appeared to be. The wagons were corralled, a consultation held as to the best method in crossing, and let me say I shall never forget this camp as the breeding grounds of the mosquito. Dense swarms of these pests attached us here, making life almost unbearable, the children the greatest sufferers, swollen hands and faces from the effects of bites. The cattle restless, difficult in keeping together at night especially. Smudges had to be made to keep off the mosquitoes. It was soon settled and agreed upon. The only way to cross was to take off the wagon boxes, caulk them as securely as could be done, and use these as boats. Load our goods for a first trial in crossing by this manner, then take the human freight. This we did without any loss, and until all our possessions were on the thither bank. My brother James had freighted over all goods in my wagon and his own, then returned to take me over with my children. We landed safely, but in his attempt to return to the wagon bed boat, for some goods he had left the wagon bed boat, he'd left the wagon bed boat, it careened or tilted, and he was thrown out into the water at about halfway across the river. I saw him come to the surface, struggling to get his boots off, which he eventually did. I knew he was a strong swimmer, but at that time, when I saw him trying to reach the floating wagon bed, I took my two children by their hands, walked close to the banks as I watched him, and at this date, late in life, I can say it was the only time I felt like self-destruction in case he should drown. After drifting downstream for a mile, I think, he finally succeeded in catching the wagon bed and safely reached terra firma, not any the worse for his ducking. We remained all the next day at this camp, then everything being in readiness, we moved on towards Fort Laramie up the North Platte. There was much sameness along this route, except the landscape changed to higher hills, or bluffs here, I think it was past Scott's Bluff. A rumor circulated here that Indians were likely to make an attack on our train. Guards were put out every night to warn us of any danger, and here is where the only serious accident happened to our entire party. A Mr. Davis, who was with us, along with his wife and 6 children, left his rifle loaded and cocked the night he went to bed, accidentally discharging it and killing him instantly. Here we buried him near Scott's Bluff, Major Bowler reading a short selection from one of the Bibles we had brought with us. I have no way to remember dates except from memory, as I kept no notes or memoranda of my trip. Here we first met Indians on the warpath, it was said, but they were peaceable to us. Too many soldiers stationed at the fort then, it required diligence on our part to keep them from stealing anything laying around loose in our camps. It was here our train divided, about half of the wagons, their occupants going on by way of the South Pass, Green River Soda Springs route to Montana, which would be the Bridger Trail area. While the rest consisting of that part I was with, and Major Bowler as wagon boss, going north by what was called the Bozeman Cutoff. This route diverged from the old Oregon Trail near Fort Laramie, thence up the North Platte, thence skirting the headwaters of the Powder River and the Tongue River, feeders of the Yellowstone. It lay between the Black Hills to our right and the Wind River Mountains on our left. This was a new road to go to Montana and Virginia City, recently located and staked out by John Bozeman. It had not been traveled by wagons to any extent the time we followed it. It ran through a new country to the white man at least. It was then considered a dangerous road to travel. It ran over, through, and across the hunting grounds of the Sioux and Blackfeet Indians who had no love for the palefaces. But good luck prevailed with us through this end of our journey. The country now changed from a dry, waterless plain to well-watered steppes, beautiful hills where there grew the buffalo and bramah grasses. Along the banks of the mountain brooks we gathered the wild strawberry and raspberry, caught many a fine mess of trout, the first we had, and here roamed the buffalo in vast numbers. Many a fine roast of their juicy meat we had. On several occasions, our wagons had to stop in order for the buffalo to pass. Their low, rumbling tramp and peculiar bellowing could be heard at a distance as the advance of a herd approached. Often they could not be diverted from the direction in which they traveled. Some of them came through our lines, but this afforded sport for the hunters who slew them in abundance, more than we actually needed. No wonder the Indian imposed any encroachment of the white into this great game country. His by right of discovery. The buffalo supplied all his wants. General Sherman well knew if he had the buffalo exterminated, it would stop all Indian wars. So Mary made it up to meet her husband in Virginia City, where they only stayed a short time before moving to Deer Lodge, which is where they spent the rest of their lives. So she wrote this in June 1920 in Deer Lodge. Her husband died in 1890 at the young age of 59, and she passed away in 1923 and is buried in Deer Lodge. I'll do a short selection. The last I wanted to talk about was some thoughts from Black Elk, who is from the Oglala Sioux, and he's the one on the left in the picture. He was born in December 1863 on the Little Powder River. His father's name was also Black Elk. I think he was maybe the fourth Black Elk in the family. His mother was White Cowsees. Black Elk was about 3 years old when his father was wounded in what they called the Battle of the 100 Slain, which is the Fetterman fight. And this quote is taken from the book Black Elk Speaks, in which he told a lot of his life story and thoughts to a man named John Neihart. I can remember that winter of the 100 Slain as a man may remember some bad dream he dreamed when he was little, but I cannot tell just how much I heard when I was bigger and how much I understood when I was little. It is like some fearful thing in a fog, for it was a time when everything seemed troubled and free. I had never seen a Wasatchew then, I think that's the term for a white person, and did not know what one looked like, but everyone was saying that the Wasatchews were coming, and that they were going to take our country and rub us all out, and that we should all have to die fighting. It was the Wasatchews who got rubbed out in that battle, and all the people were talking about it for a long time. But 100 Wasatchews was not much if there were others and others without number where those came from. I remember once when I asked my grandfather about this. I said, when the scouts come back from seeing the prairie full of bison somewhere, the people say the Wasatchews are coming, and when strange men are coming to kill us all, they say the Wasatchews are coming. What does it mean? And he said that they are many. When I was older, I learned what the fighting was about that winter and the next summer. Up on the Madison Fort, the Wasatchews had found much of the yellow metal that they worship, and that makes them crazy, and they wanted to have a road up through our country to the place where the yellow metal was. But my people did not want the road. It would scare the bison and make them go away, and also it would let the other Wasatchus come in like a river. They told us that they wanted only to use a little land, as much as a wagon would take between the wheels, but our people knew better. And when you look about you now, you can see what it was that they wanted. Once we were happy in our own country and we were seldom hungry, for then the two-leggeds and the four-leggeds lived together like relatives, and there was plenty for them and for us. But the Wasatchus came, and they have made little islands for us, and other little islands for the four-legs. And always these islands are becoming smaller, for around them surges the gnawing flood of the Wasatchu, and it is dirty with flies and breed. A long time ago, my father told me what his father told him, that there was once a Lakota holy man called Drinkswater who dreamed what was to be, and this was long before the coming of the Wasatchus. He dreamed that the four legs were going back into the earth, and that a strange race had woven a spider's web all around the Lakotas. And he said, when this happens, you shall live in square gray houses in a barren land, and beside those square gray houses you shall starve. They say he went back to Mother Earth soon after he saw this vision, and it was sorrow that killed him. You can look about you now and see that he meant these dirt-roofed houses we are living in, and that all the rest was true. Sometimes dreams are wiser than waking. That's another perspective on the Bozeman Trail. And that's about all I had. I have a few books here that I used in this presentation, and some interesting reading related to the Bozeman Trail. And I had a few people contact me before this and point me in suggest different places to go to look for information, particularly the Fort Phil Kearny Bozeman Trail Association has a great newsletter they put out, and a lot of interesting activities that they do every year. Any questions with that, or thoughts, or anything you want to say about?
I just wanted to say you can drive Pilot Trail. I don't know if anybody here does. We drove it in 2015. We were at Buffalo for a long while days, and then we found a brochure in the business center that talked about driving part of it. We did that. Thankfully, we paid attention because the brochure was wrong.
Can you repeat that?
You're up at KC and go east, and the road we were supposed to find after a certain distance did not have the name that was in the brochure, but it was the right distance, so we took it. And then fortunately, from time to time, my phone would work, so I could help them navigate. At every critical point, somehow, the phone worked, and we were able to find our way back to Buffalo.
Yeah,
It was fun, and then the spot where Fort Reno is, there's 3 cycles in a field ahead.
that's a great,
Fort Reno.
that's a great
It was
story.
a fun thing to do.
Yeah, she was saying, correct me if I got it wrong, that you traveled at least part of the trail in 2015, following a brochure, and that a lot of things in the brochure were in error.
Yeah,
So,
I made the, I cleared up back with the question.
well, that's great. Yeah. Yeah, there was an actual reenactment that a group traveled the entire distance of the Bozeman Trail in 2001. And I mean, a small group traveled the entire distance. They had, people that joined them for brief parts. But that was an interesting experience too. Some of them left, at least one of them I know left a diary of that. More interestingly.
So the family that measured the distance all along the route, has anybody checked to see how accurate they were?
That's a good question. He was asking if the family that measured the distance, the Tomlinsons, how accurate their distance was. And I saw some references to how long the trail was. I mean, I think it varied because different trains veered off and took slightly different routes, but It's a good question. I don't know if they've checked that route specifically. I've heard read a lot that said it was about 700 or 800 miles, which is about what they had, I think, from their branching off point from no, it was more like 500. My guess is it wasn't extremely accurate.
Just wondering, approximately what point did the two trails split? Is the Bozeman Trail and the Jim Bridger Trail? I assume it's like north of Laramie?
Yeah. I don't know which one would be better. It probably varied some depending on the group, but I mean, the Bridgers, they would go through this gap here in general, so probably, I saw a reference to that, north of Casper, I believe, is where they generally veered off.
The black elk, what do you think, you guys? Well, how do you spell when they have white people?
It is, and I very well probably am pronouncing it wrong, but it's Wasichu. I'm sure I pronounced it.
We drive frequently to Omaha, and we always thought that it was a little over 1,000 miles.
Oh,
And
really?
Kansas City, 1,100 miles, so that's probably pretty accurate.
Maybe it wasn't so often.
Yeah. The interstate.
She was saying they drive to Omaha and it's regularly clocked at, you said, over 1,000 miles. So it may have been not too far off the Tom Woods roadometer.
I've known people named Holman, Plowman, Hookman, all Dutch names. And being Dutch myself, I just couldn't help but be curious. Is Bozeman, is that a Dutch name? Or I didn't know any Dutch people migrating from Holland to Georgia, but I just couldn't help but be curious about what nationality he was. So.
I think we've looked into that. It's been a little while. I'm trying to remember. I think we did sort of conclude Dutch may have been back there quite a ways back. The Bozeman family is very large, and we, in our research at the museum, mostly we're trying to make connections from John Bozeman forward because we have quite a few visitors every year that are relatives of John Bozeman from various parts of the country that come in and want to know how they're related. So unfortunately, we've mostly focused on the more recent Bozeman history, but one thing I read, I think, did mention the Netherlands is a possible location that family may have come from, but that would have been really long ago.
Glad he was a good person.
You and others may be aware, a few years ago, the public television station did a special on the Bozeman Trail, and they published a DVD, which I watched this afternoon, as a matter of fact. And it's very, very good, and I suspect it can be purchased through the PBS stores or whatever. I would recommend it.
Yeah, that was a very good documentary they did a few years ago. He was talking about the PBS documentary on the Bozeman Trail that was produced a few years ago. And they did, the crew, and they were working on that, they did film the interview portions with Susan Badger Doyle, the author of Journeys from the Land of Gold. They used the museum to film the interviews with her. So you see background in the back of her segments that looks familiar, this one. But yes, I recommend that as well.
I noticed in your talk a lot of overlap with what's in that film. So I assume the film relied on that Doyle books, or, to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think that's why she was a big part of that documentary. I think it was based a lot on her work.
Yeah. Before we all break, could you give us a little plug about where the museum is at right now?
Sure.
And it might be different tomorrow. I understand. And then what we could look forward to in the near future or summer.
So the Gallatin History Museum, we're located in the former county jail building, right next to the courthouse on West Main Street in Bozeman. The building was built in 1911 and used as the jail until 1982. So we have a lot of jail-related exhibits, a lot of early Gallatin County history and some more recent history. It's a lot bigger than you'd think. If you've never been in there before, you'll be surprised at how much is in there. We have a monthly speaker series we've started back up again after a couple of years without one. So our next speaker is Dorwin Schroeder, who grew up in eastern Montana and is a retired FBI agent. And so he's going to share some stories about growing up here and then some from his career, I believe. And that'll be Saturday, I want to say January 20th, is that a Saturday? At 10 a.m. In the courthouse community room, so next door to the museum. And we'll be having more speakers monthly after that through May. We usually take a break during the summer because that's a busy time. But we reopened in June and had a really busy summer. We've been closed for a year and had a chance to redo most of our exhibits during that time we were closed. So a lot of new stuff to see if you haven't been here for a while. Also, of course, a very active research library that get a lot of people in doing family history research and looking for the history of their house, among many other things. Big photo collection as well.
All right. Well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you to Ollie for helping us collaborate. We hope you guys